Welcome to the Bible Questions podcast brought to you by BibleQuestions.org and the Holly Street Church of Christ. This podcast is dedicated to answering your Bible questions from the Bible. My name is Jeff, and along with Brian, we are the hosts of this program.
Welcome to the Bible Questions podcast and our second part on evolution and creation. My name is Brian. Along with me is Jeff. Jeff, how's it going this morning?
It's going well. We're kind of in the middle of this discussion with part one, part two, and it's in my own mind, my own opinion. It's very fascinating. It can be very confusing too, and so I hope our listeners are at least have their interest perked, if you will. Some of the things we're saying, and would encourage them to go to our website. Which will give some references, I think, at the end of our podcast for lots more information that they can actually dig into this fascinating subject about where everything came from.
Yeah, kind of one of those universal questions that all of us ask. And as you touched on in the first episode, you put together a nice study series called Christian Evidences. And if I remember correctly, you originally put this together for a class you were teaching. It's kind of the basis for a lot of what we're talking about. And as we said in that episode also, our goal here is not to try and, lose people's interest because we're going through so many technical details. What we really want to do, as you just pointed out, is kind of spark interest, talk about some of these theories of men at a high level, and then, of course, compare it to God's word. I mean, ultimately, what does God's word say? What does man say? Can they both be right? I guess we're going to be talking about first, evidence for other forms of evolution.
Right, macro evolution, molecules to man kind of evolution. This is a Big Bang that is, the dominant explanation for the origin of, the universe. Basically, the quote unquote Big Bang theory basically said that an energy in the entire universe suddenly appeared as a very small, exceedingly dense event. And I struggle with using the right terms, but that this sudden appearance then started expanding very rapidly, hence the Big Bang, roughly 14 billion years ago. And that after that point, all the matter in the universe, all the energy in the universe, all the stars, all of the galaxies, etc., kind of evolved, if you will, from this original origin out of nothing. Now, a couple points we'll make quickly. One is you can go to the internet. What's interesting, I think, is yes, Big Bang is the dominant explanation. And some might have you to believe it's the only explanation. And some might have you believe that, well, all scientists believe in the Big Bang. Well, problem is not all scientists do. And we're not talking about, religion kind of people. We're talking about scientists. In fact, this is one of the interesting aspects of science in some ways being also a faith-based system. I mean, we certainly understand Bible and Christianity as being somewhat faith-based, but there's a certain amount of faith-based to science as well. Like science has all the answers, or science is searching for all the the natural explanations of things, and we have confidence in science, and science has proclaimed, and all the scientists agree, etc. And all those are kind of faith-based statements, especially if they involve ancient events that you can't bring into a lab, that you cannot bring into a lab, cannot experiment with, cannot prove or disprove, in the lab by recreating, the conditions. A lot of this is historical, with a lot of assumptions being made. But the key point being, at least with the Big Bang, if you go to the internet and type in a simple term like problems with the Big Bang theory, for instance, you will find, surprisingly, many websites, and not just creationist websites, but actual scientific websites that will list a number of problems with the Big Bang theory. In fact, I think there was one website that had like 20 or 30 problems that the Big Bang theory just cannot explain certain observable things, which often emphasizes why people keep calling it a theory.
Agree, Jeff. It's so nice when it's scientific, right? And not just a creationist website as you might expect.
Exactly.
And, that we were in the first episode, I just kind of mentioned, can we get organization from chaos? And without going into what all these websites say, to me, that's just a central question. Do we see that anywhere else in life, right? You get something organized that comes out of something that is chaos, which is what the Big Bang would cause, right? Chaos.
Right. Well, and you raise a good point. And I've heard the analogy made that, if we were to go into, a junkyard, right, with automobiles, and, we're going to lob in some explosion, we're going to lob in a nuclear weapon, whatever the case may be, and that out of that resulting total chaos and all that energy and all the interactions that's going on, I'm going to produce an airplane. I mean, you just look at me and go, Jeff,
That's impossible, right?
what kind of drugs are you on? Yeah, totally impossible. And yet that's what's being offered. First of all, out of nothing, in the beginning, nothing, to borrow Genesis 1:1. And then there was something. And then everything flew apart. Logically, it just doesn't make sense. But I think more importantly, two quick points. One is even scientists are recognizing, yes, the universe is currently expanding. Okay, undeniable. Okay, fine. And yeah, if you try to mentally wind the clock backwards, things would have been smaller, more dense in the past. But if you keep going mentally, you get back to this point where everything in the entire universe is packed into something the size of an atom. It's like, no, wait a minute, and that's just started not to make any sense. And the scientists, in some cases, are saying, yeah, it just doesn't make sense. Another key point I'll make real briefly is, yes, indeed, we observe this universe is expanding. Is that consistent with the biblical model of creation? And the answer certainly seems to be yes. In fact, there's some very interesting mentions throughout the scriptures of the heavens being stretched, which is a fascinating reference. You can read about that in Psalms 104, verse 2, about God stretching out the heavens like a curtain. Isaiah 42, verse 5, God who created the heavens and stretched them out. Isaiah 44, 24, God, I am the Lord who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone. Jeremiah 10, 12. He has made the earth by his power. He has established the world by his wisdom. He has stretched out the heavens at his discretion. Very fascinating reference. Certainly would be consistent with, an expanding universe. But as you said, Brian, I think in some ways it boils down to how much faith, generally speaking, does it take to accept an explanation that all matter, energy, organization, galaxies, life on Earth, etc., came from nothing. To me, that takes a lot of faith.
Yeah, I'd say more faith than probably what you.
And I like that point, because it's like it's almost like we're in a courtroom, and you have two different people coming before the jury, and they're both presenting evidence, and they're asking us to believe this evidence supports one model, this evidence supports a different model, and almost like which does indeed require more faith. And some people, when you actually dig into it, like we're trying to do here, it's like, yeah, it takes more faith to believe in some of these alleged quote unquote scientific things than it does in the supernatural. So that's kind of like Big Bang, origin of the universe, and such. Brian, anything else you want to add there before we talk about some of the other evolution?
No, let's take a look at those as well. Some other interesting ones.
So there's a couple other things, from an evolution perspective, that are sometimes offered, and you might read in like, school textbooks, that, here's additional evidence, for evolution. For instance, some people will say, well, if you just simply look at the different organisms like mankind or apes and chimpanzees or, various other organisms, they look similar. And that's certainly true. And so what they would claim is, okay, so we have the evidence, similarity, similarity in overall life form, similarity in terms of internal organs, et cetera. And through this comparative anatomy, that is undeniable. Okay, fine. The conclusion from which they would say we draw from that is, okay, they must have had a common ancestor. To which we would go, well, maybe, but isn't that also consistent with having a common creator? The answer is, well, yeah. So by virtue of the fact that things are similar, doesn't really help you one way or the other. Common ancestor, common creator, it doesn't really help. Another thing which I think has been mostly discredited, offered as evidence for evolution, is something called comparative embryology, which generally speaking is if you look at an embryo, like a chicken or a fish or human, if you will, that the embryo, the fetus, if you will, goes while it's still in the womb or within the egg or whatever, goes through a number of transformations, which is fascinating in and of itself. How you can go, and this is another, I think, evidence for creation. How you can go from a single cell that has all of the genetic material pre-coded to become 2, become 4, become 8, become 16, multiplying and then starting to differentiate and start to form different structures that are all working together from the get-go, and just unfolds itself into this magnificent bird or a chick that comes out of the egg, or a human that comes out of the womb, or whatever, that's fully functional, fully viable, whatever, from a single cell, and having all that genetic material coded in that computer program, so to speak. That's mind-boggling in and of itself. But as it is ongoing, this transformational process, in the egg or the womb or whatever, like with humans, there are some things that appear like earlier transitional evolutionary kind of forms. Like this human embryo starts off with something that kind of looks like a tail, or something that looks like slits in its neck, that looks like gills. And so some people say, aha, see, there you go. What it's doing as it is unfolding in the womb, for instance, is these are like echoes of its evolutionary past. It started off as a single cell, ancient primordial ocean, and then later evolved into something that was like a fish kind of thing with gills, and later evolved into something that had a tail, and like, reptilian ancestors and mammal ancestors, and eventually becomes more human-like, and then is born. The interesting thing, if you really dig into it, that these alleged transitional structures within the fetus, the quote unquote gill slits, or its tail, or like an egg yolk sac, that some people claim, that these things allegedly left over from our ancient ancestors. It's not. That what allegedly looks like slits in the neck are not. Those are actual the beginnings of organisms that are absorbed into the head, for instance, as the embryo unfolds. And that in and of itself, again, is fascinating. How this fully this thing. I mean, Brian, again, it boggles the mind. It's almost like if I were to take some kind of a small mechanical microchip and set it down out in a field somewhere and punch the start button, and a city is going to emerge from it. Like, what? It just, again,
It defies logic, doesn't it?
Thank you. It defies logic. In fact, those quote unquote alleged gill slits turn into critical organs, like, again, within the head, the thymus gland, the parathyroid, the middle ear canals, that what is quote unquote the tail is really part of the spine, etc. The other thing in this area that I'll mention is, in earlier decades, scientists would say, hey, look at all of these quote unquote vestigial organs, basically organs that have no purpose. They used to have a purpose, and in evolutionary history, their purpose kind of died out, went away, and now we've got this little residual leftover thing. Appendix is probably a good example of that. But over time, people found out, surprise, that these alleged, vestigial leftover remains of millions of years of evolution, they do serve a purpose. which is, again, a way of saying, here are some evidences, generally speaking, that evolutionists will offer in support of the theory. But as you dig deeper, you start seeing cracks in the argumentation, and you can get to a point where you can say, no, that's I can see what you're pointing to as evidence to look at, but it doesn't fit your model. It doesn't fit.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me how I feel like a lot of these come about because when theory one is disproven and we go to theory two and theory three, and at the end of the day, the complexity alone, I think, really shows that it just doesn't make sense to think that this could happen once again over millions of years in the ways that they've described, right? And
In very small micro changes, each of which gives the organism some kind of evolutionary advantage that survival of the fittest can take over and start to, oh, that's a good thing. We'll keep those descendants of that organism will thrive. It's like small random changes. Yeah, it just doesn't seem to fit.
no. So, Jeff, in our first podcast, we were talking about different reasons or different philosophies of men, if you will, and in addition to what you just covered, as far as these different alternative meanings or thoughts for evolution, we also have theistic evolution, right? Which is we have people who profess to be Bible believers. So hey, they believe in God, they believe in the Bible, but they still believe in evolution. So they came up with this sort of hybrid model where they attempt to harmonize the Bible's account of, our origin with proven in their eyes old earth and evolution. And so they combine it. And so I one of the easiest ways I think for people to understand what theistic evolution is, it's really God set everything in motion and he allowed evolution to sort of take its course. And so, well, is there evidence for that? Well, let's talk a little bit about that. So, there is this idea of what we call the day-age theory that's intertwined within theistic evolution. And so this is an effort to reconcile, the literal Genesis account of creation with modern scientific theories on the age of the universe, the age of the earth, and life and humans and so forth. And so this theory holds that the 6 days referred to in the Genesis account of creation are not ordinary 24-hour days, but rather are much longer periods of time, thousands or millions of years. We talked a little bit also in our last podcast about this idea of progressive creation. So in other words, sudden bursts of creation over long static time periods. And, when you think about the religious belief that God created new forms of life gradually over a period of hundreds of millions of years, it really doesn't match up with what the Bible says and teaches, and we'll get more into that in just a minute. There's also something called the gap theory that's intertwined in this as well, and that is this: you have an ancient Earth with a relatively recent 6-day reconstruction that in their eyes suggests, well, if you look at Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 and 2, there's this gap in time. So if we look at Genesis 1 and 2, it just says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then verse 2 says, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And so, their, once again, argument is that, yeah, we agree with that, but there was a tremendous amount of time that elapsed between verse 1 and verse 2. So, gap creationism really is, a form of old earth creationism that's expressing the belief that, this creation period as described in the book of Genesis, once again, involved, 6 literal 24-hour days, but there was a gap of time between the 2 distinct creations in the first and second verses of Genesis. So, in their eyes, this theory explains many scientific observations, including the age of the earth. So, they're just saying, hey, both can be true here, right? So all of that, I think we would agree, conflicts with what we might call young earth creationism, or, the account of creation in the Bible. And so do we accept the Bible account of its origins, some of these microevolutionary things that are real, but, rejection of old earth and molecules to man evolution? And so we have to look at theistic evolution and say, okay, here's all these theories. So what does the Bible say, right? And when we think about, the biblical references in Genesis chapter 1 being literal days or not, let's start with that. Is it literally 24-hour days in which God created all these things? Now, some might look at all that God did create, and if you look through Genesis 1, you'll see it just lists in detail. On this day he did this, on this day he did this. Could God create all that in a day? Well, I think it's pretty easy to say if he's a supreme being, it's yes. The answer would be yes, right? But more importantly, for instance, in Genesis chapter 1, after verse 2, right, verses 3 through 5 say, then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Verse 5, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Now here's the key phrase. So the evening and the morning were the first day. So if I told somebody, hey, we're going to do this in the morning, and then we're going to do this in the evening, or the evening and morning, I think we would all say, well, that's just one day. That's Tuesday. That's Saturday. We all understand that and accept that's a 24-hour period that's being referred to. And if you were to look at verses 8, and verses 13, and verses 19, and verse 23, in fact, if you look after every single day of creation, it always ends with the statement, so the evening and the morning were the first day, second day, third day, and so forth. Once again, just reading that, not putting any of your own thoughts in it. What do you think of? Well, that's a literal day, right? Why would it not be a literal day? Well, it goes beyond that. So for instance, if you look at Exodus chapter 20 in verse 11, it says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath and hallowed it. So those of you that are familiar with the old law, the old covenant, there was the Sabbath day that, as it says here, recognized and honored God for his creation and remembered that he rested on the seventh day. Now, once again, if you read that passage, what would make you think that wasn't literal days? Then you would have to say the Sabbath day should be, recognized over millions of years, right? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. God even, we see some statements from him. Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Genesis 5 verse 2. He, speaking of God, created them male and female, and blessed them and called mankind in the day they were created. So does it say anything about man evolving? God created the apes and they eventually became humans? No. It's very clear. He created male and female. In fact, if you dig a little bit deeper into Genesis, you can see that woman was created from man. God took a rib from Adam. All very clear in the scriptures. Even Jesus, under the new covenant, the New Testament, said in Matthew 19, verses 4 and 5, from the beginning of creation, God made male and female. Mark chapter 10, verse 6. But from the beginning of the creation, it says, God made them male and female. So over and over, we have this, whether it's God saying it or Jesus saying it, making it very clear. God made man and woman as fully formed human beings in the beginning. And then one final passage here, Jeff, and then I'll let you give your thoughts on this section. And that is Hebrews chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. God, his works were finished from the foundation of the world, and he rested the seventh day, as we talked about earlier. And verse 3 says the works were finished from the foundation of the world. Now, if you finish something, would you allow it through evolution to continue evolving? No, that doesn't make sense, right? Finished, I think we all understand, means it's complete. Nothing else needs to be done. So anyhow, several points there, Jeff. I'll give you a chance to chime in if you'd like.
Yeah, and as you said, good points. I think what you see are Christians, and well-meaning at that, when faced with allegedly overwhelming scientific evidence, and I say allegedly, that they go, well, I'm not willing to renounce my faith. I'm not really willing to deny God. I still want to hold on to that. But I'll go into the scriptures and I'll start reading into the scriptures something that arguably is not there. in order to harmonize the Bible with what the scientists are saying. And as we've mentioned a lot in part one and even in the beginnings of part two, you don't necessarily need to do that because, even within the scientific part of the equation, so to speak, there's enough evidence that says the dominant theory about science and evolution, from a scientific perspective, has problems. As we said, irreducible complexity and all that kind of stuff. So you don't necessarily need to harmonize the Bible with what alleged science says. So there's that. The other thing is, as you attempt to harmonize the Bible with what science allegedly says, is you start, in essence, denying what the Bible says. You start distorting it. You start twisting it. You have to start reading things in between the lines that aren't really there. And you get to a position where you're in between the two models and you've got problems with both of the models.
It's like being between a rock and a hard place, right?
It is, well, it is, because you basically you have to come up with some unusual reading of the words, like morning and evening is a day. Well, that's not really morning and evening is a day. That's really an allegory for millions of years. Or yet that yes, and on a given day, God did a certain creative act, and then he stepped away for 1 billion years or several 100 million years, and then came back for another day and did some more tweaking, etc. One of the interesting things that I did at one point, and it's kind of detailed, so I don't want to go into too much detail here, but it is on our the classroom material that we keep referencing, is if you look at the evolutionary model, and if you look at the, if you will, the Genesis model, they're very different, obviously, not only in time span, but also in the sequence of things. I mean, for instance, evolution says, well, the stars were created first, then the sun was created, and then eventually the planet with its land mass, and then eventually the large primordial ocean, and then you have single-celled life, and then fish, and then the beginnings of land life with insects and reptiles, and then eventually mammals, primates, man. Okay. If you look at the Genesis account, Earth is first, light is second, then comes the oceans, then comes the land, and eventually you have land plants, and later you have fish. And so the sequence is different. So when a person tries to adopt this in-between thing that says, well, I'm going to reconcile what the Bible says with what science says, is you still have a problem, because the Genesis account would still be out of sequence with what the alleged scientific model has. So you're right, you're definitely between a rock and a hard place, or you're dealing with something that's neither fish nor fowl, or you're trying to straddle the fence. And it just doesn't work because you still have problems. And you don't, and as we said, you don't even need to straddle the fence. And, you can stay on one side and explain, the biblical account, even from a scientific perspective. So I just thought I'd throw that out there for our
No,
audience.
it's very good. It just shows you how many problems are created when you start going down this path. And
Right.
it's interesting when we talked about this gap theory. So this, going back, there's this suggestion that between, verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1, there's this huge gap of time. And, so when you think about, well, is that plausible? Well, I mean, when you look at the entire chapter of Genesis, Genesis 1, it all flows very well. Certainly there's a natural flow from verse 1 to 2. And, if you think about it, if there was this gap, surely God would have revealed this gap to us in his desire to let things continue to evolve. I mean, that's important information. Why wouldn't he want man to know that and understand that? Passage that we like to refer to once in a while, Deuteronomy 29:29, where it talks about the secret things belong to the Lord our God. It goes on to say, but those things which are revealed belong to us and our children forever. Why? That we may do all the words of this law. So one thing that God did through the gospel was he made sure that man understood his origin, that he was the one who created everything. And as we talked about in the previous section, that his works were finished after day 6, and that is why he rested on day 7. So going back to your previous point, Jeff, you would have to argue, well, he didn't really mean it wasn't really finished. He didn't give us the full explanation. Well, then why would he say it was finished? Why would he rest if he wasn't truly finished, or creation wasn't truly finished? And so, when you think about it, there's just nothing that would suggest this, right? And so, when you think about which explanation best fits, I think we're really starting to see more and more the biblical account of creation, or what we might call young earth creationism, is the most plausible of all these theories that are put forth. And in fact, you kind of alluded to this, Jeff, but if I asked you, if the Genesis narrative of creation and the global flood can't be trusted as factual history, well, what does that imply regarding the rest of the Bible that talks about those events as fact?
Well, you wouldn't be able to trust it. I mean, it's interesting, and it may shock our audience to say, but Jesus was a creationist. Paul was a creationist. Did they believe in the literal, 6-day creation? Yes. Moses, etc. So if I can't, it's a snowball. If I that's rolling down a hill, or a domino effect. If I cannot believe the Genesis account as a reasonable explanation, I mean, it's not a scientific textbook, obviously, but as a reasonable explanation or factual explanation of origins, then I really can't believe Moses, who cites it. I can't believe Paul, who cites it. I can't believe Jesus, who cites it. And so now the whole Bible just collapses. If I can't accept the very beginning, I can't accept the whole thing. It all kind of stands or falls together.
Yeah, and that's exactly why a mixed theistic evolution theory just falls apart on so many levels. So I guess we want to shift gears now and talk a little bit about the geological record, or the geologic record, right? And what that reveals to us.
Yeah, and again, here's another very deep subject, because at least in Genesis 1, when God was done, creating everything, it was pronounced as very good. And yet there is evidence, undeniable, that you start digging into the ground, or you see where, for instance, highway construction people have carved out, part of a ridge, for instance, to push a road through, and you can see the different layers of sediment, etc. Grand Canyon, good example of another, through a natural process, all these different layers, you know, buried in the ground, all these fossilized remains, countless, plants and animals, and the natural question is, okay, where did they all come from? Right? And so that leads us into this discussion about, as you said, the geologic record, or what's called the geological column. Layers of rock, one on top of another, with all kinds of fossilized or mineralized remains of, plants and animals. What's interesting is around the planet, there are some places where those layers of sediment, if you will, um, don't exist at all. Like up in Canada, there's absolutely, it's just bedrock. There's no layers of sediment at all. To my understanding, down in the Texas Gulf Coast, where you have like up to 12 miles deep of these, sediment deposits. On top of that, in terms of the geologic record, you also have interesting things regarding what's called plate tectonics, or continental drift, deep fractures in the ocean's crust, and these, plates moving apart or smashing together. You get all kinds of earthquakes, Pacific Rim of Fire, all those kinds of things. And so you have these unusual processes that are currently going on, and that historically, through, again, looking through these sediments, have gone on in the past. Where did all this come from? Which leads us to at least three models, or three explanations that have been offered. One, which in some ways has kind of been discredited, is called uniformitarianism. I know that's a big word, uniformitarianism, that basically says the present is the key to the past. So any sort of ongoing current process or rate of decay or deposits or whatever If you extrapolate backwards, that's what's accountable for what goes on in history. So, for instance, if I look at the bottom of the Grand Canyon and I see the Colorado River, given the current, flow of water, I could probably calculate, some erosion effect that the river is doing on the underlying, rock that's at the bed of the river, and I can use that current rate and then assume that rate is the same going back in time and say, see, I have the Grand Canyon and it took, X millions of years to be eroded based on the assumption that the current rate is the same as the ancient rate. Uniformitarianism. As again, as I said, sometimes you'll hear the phrase, the present is the key to the past. And honestly, within the scientific community, that particular model, you may find some people that promote it, but even in the scientific community, people are saying, no, 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 we're starting to see evidence that in some ways the present is not the key to the past, that the existing processes we see going on now can't account for some of the things we see again in the geologic record. So that leads us to another model or an offering, sometimes called catastrophism, which basically says the geologic record is preserving a record, if you will, of life on the planet that has evolved over millions of years, molecules to man, and that from time to time there are occasional major disruptive cataclysmic events, sometimes local, like a volcano erupting, sometimes global, like allegedly the dinosaurs were wiped out millions of years ago by a meteor that struck the planet and threw all the dust up into the atmosphere, resulting in like a nuclear winter for a long period of time, and 90% of the creatures died off. Again, catastrophism, but again within an old earth kind of construct. The other third model, if you will, is catastrophism, right? But from a young earth perspective, that at least given what the Bible has to say, that there have been major, massive alterations of the planet in its history. Two main events, if you will, and that these happen very quickly, not over millions of years, but over very short time periods. In fact, if you look at two that I know of, one is in Genesis 1:9, where somehow you have this watery, muddy chaos, if you will, and God separates the land from the water. Well, that's a massive hydrological alteration of the planet, right? The other, which some people may not stop to think about, is the Genesis flood of Genesis chapters 6 through 9, where some people might think, well, yeah, Genesis flood is going to rain for a while. No, you dig into the context that we're going to get into in a few moments, and it is a lot more involved than what a lot of people think. And in fact, some people may say, well, yeah, the quote unquote Genesis flood did occur, but it was local. In fact, some will say, well, yeah, that's what happened during the last ice age with lower, more ice on the planet and lower ocean levels, that the Black Sea over in Europe, Eurasia, was dry, or the Mediterranean was dry. And that as the ice age ended, or one of the ice ages ended, and the sea levels started to rise, that eventually the sea level overtopped the bridge, the land bridge, if you will, that's keeping the water out of the Mediterranean or out of the Black Sea, and it just rushed in. And that was the origin of the quote unquote Genesis flood myth, which I would assert is not a myth. The problem is, again, when you go into the Genesis account, Genesis chapter 6, beginning with verse 5, give or take, and you read the account, this flood covered the entire planet, killing all land animals that breathed. That it was a year, 40 days and 40 nights it rained, yes, but the floodwaters persisted on the planet for an entire year. And in fact, you see that reinforced by New Testament references. Matthew 24, where it talks about the ancient world and this, flood taking them all away. Luke 17:27, the flood came and destroyed them all. 2 Peter 2:5, the old world, if you will, a little bit later on, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 6, overflowed with water and perished. Global flood, no doubt. And again, if you also kind of read into the account, there's these interesting little hints. And I'm going to, Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, for example. Fountains of the great deep being broken up. What does that mean? Well, if that is indeed a massive release of subterranean water, now I have this massive hydrological event that's, tearing up, rocks and causing massive amounts of erosion and tidal waves and massive earthquakes and potentially the triggering, if I'm breaking up, the crust. Now we're talking about plate tectonics potentially and continental drift and massive extinction and massive rapid burial of plants and animals. And that's consistent with the geologic record. Now, some people may say, well, now, wait a minute. Okay, water, subterranean. Okay, yeah. But rainwater, where'd all this water come from? Well, again, there's some tantalizing hints. When you read some of the description about life before the flood and effects in life after the flood, tantalizing little hints. Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, and Genesis chapter 2, verse 6, and Genesis chapter 7, verse 11 suggest, they don't require, but they suggest some kind of a large, some people call it a canopy or surrounding layer of water vapor, around the earth that might have resulted in, nice, uniform or very mild temperatures, before the flood, somewhat even heating, mists, watering the ground, very rich plant life, which eventually could be the source of a lot of our fossil fuels that got buried in the flood. And that after the flood, given this massive precipitation out of the sky, in addition to the water, welling up from below, wild temperature fluctuations, ice ages, violent weather, storms, diversification of ecosystems on the planet, rainforests and desert, which would encourage, wildlife diversity, maybe even all this churning up of sediment and precipitation of this canopy and increased allowance of solar radiation, et cetera, and nuclear radiation within particles within the crust. Maybe that helps account for why human life went from 1,000-year average age to only 100. I don't know, in terms of increased radiation and mutation. Anyway, lots of hints of massive, massive, massive changes between the world that then was and the world that we see today. Now, again, people may say, well, wait a minute, Jeff, if the earth was covered with water and, current mountain ranges like the Rockies here in the United States or the Himalayas over in Asia are, tens of thousands of feet high, and they were all covered, where'd the water go? And I think it's a legitimate question. What we see in the scriptures are, again, some tantalizing little hints. Brian, if you will go over to Psalms 104 and read verses 5 through 9.
Okay, here it says, "You who laid the foundations of the earth, so that it should not be moved forever, you covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, they fled. At the voice of your thunder, they hastened away. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valleys, to the place which you founded for them. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth."
Which, as I said, is a very fascinating account. And you wish you had more detail, Brian. I
Oh,
really
yeah.
do.
It does
But
pique the interest the way it's
it
worded.
does, and at least kind of hints at, given some of the processes that I described, massive upwelling from below of water that had been stored, et cetera, potentially triggering, movement of crustal plates, et cetera. It's entirely plausible that before the flood, land was perhaps more uniform, not the wide extreme of, sea level up to very high mountains, and that it could have taken less water to cover the land that then was. Don't assume that the mountain ranges you see now existed back then. Okay, maybe the land was shallower, but more importantly, we are seeing evidence of massive mountain upwelling, like the Himalayas, right, or even within the Rocky Mountain areas. That is the result of plate tectonics and continental drift and et cetera. So it's entirely plausible that those processes triggered by the flood would have raised up the mountains as well as lowering the depths of the ocean. And now I have an increased reservoir, if you will, for the water to run back into. And now that's yet another huge hydrologic event of the upwelling of the land and all this water rushing off could reasonably rapidly account for some of the structures we see. I mean, Grand Canyon is a good example of that, where all this massive water, just inconceivable quantities of water rushing off the continent, carving off, all these, channels and gullies and whatever in months, days. Certainly Mount St. Helens, when interrupted, and some of the processes around Mount St. Helens around 1980, fairly sizable structures, gullies and valleys and, miniature Grand Canyons, if you will, formed within hours. And the volcanic sedimentation, whatever, which I think kind of gives us a hint, if you will, of what the processes that could have been involved with the global flood. Yeah, I think, again, coming back to the models, is it reasonable that the processes as described in the Bible could account for the geologic record and all these sediments and all these buried plants and animals to include, massive coal deposits, et cetera? And I would submit the answer is yes. And again, this is a very deep subject. We certainly would, encourage our listeners to go back to the website, to some of the classroom material that I created, as well as some other articles that we've got, to study about the rapid formation of the geologic column, as well as the credibility of Noah's Ark, which a lot of people will, laugh at in terms of putting, all of the species, which the Bible doesn't use the term species, into this little toy boat, which is often the way it's portrayed. But if, again, you look at the biblical account, the ark was huge. In fact, Brian, I think you've seen, or you know of people that have seen models or replicas of it today, and it's absolutely mind-boggling how big the thing is.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, in fact, there's here in the United States, right outside of Cincinnati, actually on the Kentucky side of the Ohio River, there is a creation museum, which if anybody's in that area, can highly recommend that, because they actually have a working model, as you just described, Jeff, of how the flood could have created these valleys and so forth. And then they have, to your point about the ark, within the creation museum itself, what they feel is a scale replica section of the ark that you can walk through, and they show you once again, with really solid evidence as to why it was probably constructed that way. And then that same company created actually an amusement park that's based on creation, and they there have a full size replica, or what they consider to be what the ark would have most likely been like to carry all these animals and people and so forth. So anyhow, very fascinating and well researched and presented. So highly recommend that.
Well, and I think I think you kind of indirectly make a key point. We hear so much about evolution via the public school, and we made this point in our first part. We hear so much about evolution in the public schools, in TV shows, in natural history museums, etc. And for the most part, most people will say, "Oh, well, okay, I guess that must have been the way it is." And you very rarely hear the other side. It's almost like you have to go looking for it, right?
Right.
But when you do go looking for it and you start digging into it, not only from a biblical perspective, but also from a scientific perspective, you begin to realize there's a lot more to the story than what the quote unquote scientific establishment would have you believe as the dominant scientific model. I might say dogma, because there is some faith involved there, as we've been mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very good information. I appreciate you bringing all these passages in, because ultimately what you read and what you referenced to the Bible really helps to explain and provide a reasonable explanation to what's occurred here. And so certainly, as you pointed out, encourage everybody to dig in deeper to that, because it's just interesting, number one. But number two, it also helps certainly when you're discussing it, you're thinking about it, and you're deciding in your own mind what's the most plausible. All right, Jeff, well, that wraps it for this episode. For our listeners, we will have one more episode to finish up this series. And next time, we're going to talk about dating methods. So, ancient life, how do scientists date and estimate how old something is? We'll talk about something called carbon-14 dating. Then we'll move and talk about the fossil record and dinosaurs and man and what we can learn from that. And then we'll also talk about what does the Bible teach in contrast to what men's theories are. And then we'll finish up by answering a couple Bible questions that have been submitted on this topic. So please join us for our final episode in this series.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Bible Questions podcast. We invite you to visit our website at biblequestions.org, where you can find over 1,000 scripture-filled articles on a wide variety of Bible topics, along with about 24 free Bible study lessons and other Bible study aids. Plus, you can submit a Bible question to us to get a personal response within a couple of days. Check it all out at biblequestions.org.